Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video. This is going to be my episode ranking list for Netflix Avatar. So I'll be giving you my top 8, my order for the episodes as we go through this. Just at the start, I will mention that if you are a YouTube channel member or a Patreon member at the right tier, you will currently have access to my episode 3 reaction for Netflix Avatar. The episode 4 one should be going up probably tomorrow, and then gradually with the rest of them as the days go on. But that's just to mention that. Just before we jump into the list, some little bits that I just want to get out here in terms of notes. So first one I'll say about my list is that to me there's a clear quality gap between my top 3 episodes and then the lower 5 episodes. So to me, the 3 that I rank the highest, there's a pretty noticeable gap over the other 5 in my opinion. But in general, I would say all the episodes do have their good points. They also do have their kind of bad points as well, but obviously some more than others. My general opinion on the show is still that in general, I enjoyed it. I liked it. I think it's a good adaptation. Perhaps not very good or excellent, but of the level to where I want to see it get its book 2 and 3. I'd like to see them continue this to see how they can improve as the seasons go on. To me, it was definitely good enough that I would like to see more. Final note here is just on the idea of changes, and especially when you use changes as a criticism of this show in terms of adaptation. To me, we're trying to get across the nuance here, and so we're trying to avoid going into extremes when we are talking about the show and talking about change. Change is good and bad. So in the same way that we obviously want to avoid criticizing every change made simply because it's a change, that way, you know, you're almost going down the path of suggesting that a one-to-one adaptation is what is needed, but one-to-one adaptations basically never really happen, and they're not really kind of feasible to happen. So we want to avoid that. Just, it's a change, therefore it is bad. But on the other side of things, we also want to avoid the habit of just letting any and all changes basically go undiscussed, that we cannot criticize any change because, well, the show has to make changes. You know, we can't use that as too much of a cover everything defense, a get out of jail free card for every single situation, that it's its own version. So you can't complain about it being different from the original. No, that's equally as unfair as criticizing everything for being a change. Because you want to also avoid the idea that if you let everything go, then the show is allowed to just basically not care about its source material, and basically by the end you're allowing it to barely resemble the source material, and it's okay because every single change is just allowed to happen at will. Nuance here. There will be, I think everyone probably has their changes that they like, and also some changes that they don't like, and some in between, changes that you're maybe only okay with, or it's a good change in theory but it didn't quite work in context. You know, these type of things happen. So just trying to get that across. But now, let's jump into the list. So my number 8, my lowest ranked episode of Netflix Avatar is going to be N104, Into the Dark. So this is the second part. It's the second Omashu episode. This is the one that has quite a lot of boomy stuff in here. This is where they bring up Secret Tunnel from Season 2 into Season 1. And you can probably tell why I think this is the weakest episode. I think it has some of the worst adaptation kind of changes in terms of, like, I think Secret Tunnel was very badly misused. Some of it is decent. Like the Badger Moles, I think, looked all right, but they weren't used all that much. I ultimately think, I don't think they executed on what Secret Tunnel is meant to be correctly by having it be Sokka and Katara. It felt very forced because we have to enter Boomy's palace rather than the correct way I think it needed to be used, like in the original. There's just other things as well, like the fact that, you know, to me, Jet and the Mechanist do really fall to the wayside in this second episode. They don't really feel particularly important. And then we have to probably get a little bit into the idea of Bumi himself. They make a decision to do something different with Bumi, make him more serious, make the 100 years have really had a deep effect on him, and he is one of these characters that ends up criticizing Aang for being away for all that time. And to me, it's just not quite the right approach to have with Bumi. Bumi as a character is so unique and different. Bringing him almost too far down to earth by having him, like a lot of other characters, really criticize Aang for his responsibility and being away, when he can clearly see that, like, obviously Aang was trapped in ice for 100 years, and especially when you don't actually, like, show flashback of Omashu under siege, showing Bumi sort of changing over time. I don't think they get this one as right as it needs to be to justify such a kind of notable change for the character. Especially when, like, the resolution to this arc is kind of weird, where Sokka and Katara come out. Bumi had just mentioned the idea of, like, you can't really rely on your friends, but then Aang's friends come in and the bison whistle comes back up, and it's like, what point are we making here? Like, okay, Aang brings kind of hope back to Bumi, but it's in a kind of weird way. I just don't think Bumi was the correct character to do this with. And I think, as much as I think the 103 and 104 arc is a reasonable attempt at adapting a lot of these episodes, it just wraps up everything way too quickly here at the same time. And while there are good moments, like the Iroh talking to the Earthbenders about, like, the Siege of Ba Sing Se, that was very good. It's 1-2 scenes in the middle of an episode that is overall focused on this stuff that, to me, didn't quite work as well as I think it needed to. Number 7 on my list is going to be N107, The North. So the second last episode. Maybe a little bit surprising that it's down here, but to me, in terms of the 2 finale episodes, this was the one where I think they made the most mistakes, because they really are only adapting Waterbending Master here, but guess what? We don't really do any waterbending training. Aang doesn't learn waterbending. Katara only learns waterbending from herself. So you really took away, I think, a lot of Pakku and what he's about, especially not doing the Gran connection with the necklace bit at the end. They just completely never touched on that. I just found that to be a very odd plot point that made Pakku, you took away the depth of his character by doing that. And to me, you also made Katara's arc kind of go in a little bit of a weird direction when it comes to the whole who's your master, it's myself situation. And that, to me, didn't quite work in the way it needed to. Kind of, in a way, similarly, I didn't really like that Karuk was asking Aang to basically abandon his friends, and then for Katara, it's like Pakku as well as Aang is telling her not to participate in the battle. It's just a bit overdone as a plot point, and I feel, as much as overall, I think Karuk was reasonably well done, bringing some Shadow of Kyoshi information into play about him being the Dark Spirit Hunter, his injuries from that, no one really knowing about this. I feel you needed to come back to this at some point to be like Karuk having his open awakening moment in a way about Team Avatar. So I just felt like him saying, you know, like, there is no Team Avatar, only the Avatar, when he actually did have a Team Avatar. But I think that's more of a broad criticism of how they do some of the past life scenes here, where they're a little bit too negative in parts when it comes to the role of the Avatar requires you to be on your own, when, like, every Avatar, as far as we know, had their own, like, kind of Team Avatar, basically. So it's just one of those kind of frustrating bits in terms of how this really came together. But not as many criticisms of the previous episode, because I felt like Sokka and Yue's dynamic was pretty well done. Again, the whole Fox thing was a bit weird in terms of just like, come on, you need to explain that if you're going to do something weird like that. But I didn't mind the idea that, like, they had technically met in a previous episode. That actually helped to at least start their relationship and make it different from the dynamic with Suki. Stuff like, say, Han being very different was another change that I didn't mind. I don't think we needed the drama over, like, fighting for Yue. So freeing it up so that Sokka had a little bit of a good relationship with a Northern warrior, I thought was actually quite decent overall. But we will move on to my number 6 on my list is N103 Omashu. So yeah, the other part of the Omashu arc goes here. This one I find to be much more solid as an episode. I don't think it suffers from the same kind of almost resolving itself too quickly problems of the previous one. And this is where you kind of see the potential of what they were trying to do here, of like, okay, Sokka and the Mechanist have their little arc while Katara and Jet have theirs, and when the group kind of comes back together, there's an argument about what's happening because there's crossover between the plots, that Jet is suspicious of Fire Nation spies, one of which basically is the Mechanist, and then there's these bombings going on to take out the Fire Nation spies, and that is Jet. And so it's this idea of like the two siblings have attached themselves onto these people and they believe them, but you know, they only realize later that there's a flaw with that. It's where I feel, you know, the ultimate arc they did in 101, 103 and 104 with Katara and Sokka, and maybe what their sibling dynamic was, didn't work out quite as well. Moments of it were good, like Sokka bringing up their father, and then you know, you're not dad, that being kind of a very kind of sad moment to maybe see get brought up, but then her kind of acknowledging his responsibility and how hard it was on him, that was kind of nice. What wasn't, I think, as good was the kind of Katara complaining about how, like, you treat me like a little girl, like you always dismiss everything I say, and it's like, I think that dynamic could have been done, I think, overall a little bit better. Because Sokka and the Mechanist, I thought, had some decent scenes together. Jet and Katara had some nice scenes, like kind of bonding over what happened to their mothers, and this helping Katara to, you know, get to a new stage with her waterbending. That was kind of nice. The problem here is just that you don't fully get across the full scope of what is needed here. It is, as you can tell, multiple episodes trying to be crammed into one, whereas what the book overall needed was more time for the characters to just have little arcs here and there, like it has in the original, because it has the time to do all these smaller episodes. But instead it's like each of these characters has like 3 or 4 of their arcs only kind of crammed into the time to do one of them. I just feel like overall the Omashu arc just needed a little bit more depth to it in terms of delve into the history. Like you did that in the opening episode. In other parts you do it as well. Cover it here, because I just felt I was a little bit confused about Omashu's actual role in the war or not, because they were attempting to sum up like 100 years of Omashu without really saying any details on it. So I think a lot of that is the reason why I don't like rate it super highly, but I don't like hate it either. Next on my list, number 5 is going to be N108 Legends. And this was one of those ones, when I was writing up this list, I was just at the end of my rewatch, so I was basically watching this episode as I was kind of putting the list together, and it just fell down a little bit from where I had it initially placed, so that's why it's here in the kind of bottom half of the list. It's just that it's good, it's mostly accurate, but it's the little bits and pieces that don't quite come together that I think make this one not fully come together. Like Zhao's arc, I feel just by the end, not properly working. He's killed by Iroh. They don't really set up the whole idea of the ocean spirit dragging him into the spirit world. It's like they forget who specifically the vengeance of the ocean spirit is aimed at in this version, and I think that's almost unforgivable oversight, that they kind of just had the ocean spirit go in the complete opposite direction of Zhao, and they never actually did anything with that. They tried to make the kind of Agni Kai plus the fight in the north, put them together into one here. That didn't quite work, but what did work was him revealing that, like, he's basically been working with Azula this whole time. That's probably some of Azula's best stuff in the book, and it's some of Zhao's best stuff, because you took away his trip to the library, because you took away Zhong Zhong, the replacement of that with Azula was, I think, a nice change. But I do feel Zhao suffers a little bit from just, you took away quite a lot of the unique aspects of him, and kind of didn't replace it with as much as you absolutely needed to. Similarly, again referencing Zhao, the whole Karuk knife plot didn't need to happen. Because they don't even explain that the knife is required to kill a spirit. They just imply that very vaguely as being the thing. Otherwise, it's just like, Aang, Zhao has my knife. It's made of spirit materials. Okay. And it's just like, okay, I sort of get what you're going for here, but you explained enough to where you don't need the knife. That the spirits on this one day are in their mortal forms, so they're vulnerable. You can kill them in any way. Why do you have to overcomplicate it with the knife? That's, I think, the big problem here, because they don't go into enough detail to explain the idea of like spirits when they're killed change forms, and that here is a permanent way to kill them or anything like that. That's to me a little bit confusing. And as it relates to, I suppose, the rebirth of the moon spirit, again, the whole fox thing I think comes up a little bit of like, why when Yue becomes the spirit, why doesn't it become a fox, and how did that really come into play? But otherwise, that sacrifice that Yue makes is still pretty well done. You still get the Sokka Arnuk scene afterwards, but then we probably have to talk a little bit about the Aang will be forever lost in the vengeance of the ocean spirits. You know, it's not the Avatar anymore. I didn't like this one as much because I thought they overplayed their hand here. They tried to make way too much out of this. They tried to give Katara the speech, basically talking to a brick wall, but it didn't work. And just the timing made Katara come across a little silly because it was so clear she wasn't going to break through to Aang, and that there was only a chance to talk to Aang when the moon spirit actually came back. And it was like, come on, it was fine the way it was in the original. They didn't need to change it like that. And it's just mostly fine, but some problems that just, to me, held it back from being in the upper echelon of episodes, in my opinion. So getting into the top four, number 4 is going to be N105, Spirited Away. I debated back and forth on this one about, like, should it be lower? Because I've seen people criticize this one a little bit more. This is one where I can see the potential, and I can really see the vision of what they were trying to do here. Use the Fog of Lost Souls to have a big backstory or a big personal moment for all 3 main characters. Use the spirit world in the right way as like an improvement over the original episode, which from a mechanical point of view, great. You solved the confusing aspect of that episode by having them actually go to the spirit world. But on the other side of things, you did really confuse things by overcomplicating it, because like Heibai is the crux of this at the start, but by no means is Heibai the focus of the episode, and he gets completely forgotten over the course of this, also basically a 2-parter, to the point where like there is no real resolution. Aang buries the acorn, and that's meant to be it, but we never see like Heibai change back. We never really properly established like what Heibai did. Like the implication is that Heibai took everyone to the spirit world, but then Ko takes over after that. But no, actually, wait, the Fog of Lost Souls captures them because it's the spirit prison, but they don't quite tell you that about the fog, that it actually is a spirit itself, and then Ko takes over and he's feasting on all these people. And it's just, you took a relatively simple concept for an introduction of the spirit world one, and you really added almost, I would say, just a bit too much to the episode, is what I would say there. In that, I borderline would have been okay if you just didn't use Heibai. Just say Ko. Ko is here in Senlin taking people, and just have it be Fog of Lost Souls and Ko. Don't bring up Heibai if you're not actually going to do stuff with Heibai, is kind of my thoughts here. On the backstories, the Aang one I'm mostly okay with because it was a needed scene, I think, especially in this version where we had met Gyatso quite heavily at the start. I don't like that we just were very hand-wavy about, like, wait, why are you able to do this kind of, like, one-time survive as a spirit, but then you can't after that, when we didn't really show him doing anything as he died against Sozin. So there's just this weird idea that, like, wait, you can make a choice when you die to, like, pass on or not. And because we never really established, like, Gyatso's spiritual level exactly, it's just a bit of a, like, I'll let you buy with this one, because the scene that you get with Gyatso is still pretty good in the end. because I thought it was so important that he tell Aang there was nothing you could have done. Don't have the regrets. You would have just died along with everyone else. It basically, it was destiny that you were away when it happened. You now have a chance to do something. That sort of idea. And I felt the emotion when Aang was just like, "Oh, I'll come back and see you again," and Gyatso has to be like, "No, you have to go and do this, because if I tell you I won't come back, will you actually go back?" type situation. And he just has to kind of tell him that kind of tragic lie, and then it's revealed in the next episode that he can't see Gyatso again. So that was really well done. I think there's obviously going to be some debate about the whole Sokka and Katara one. The Sokka one is just weird because why are we presenting Hakoda so negatively? This is a really negative scene, and I get it, the whole idea of the fog is that it specifically highlights a bad truth that you almost don't want to relive, and so that's why Sokka gets this moment brought up. They sort of attempt to fix it by having Yue in, is it the finale or whatever, reverse this, 107 I think it is, but anyway, Yue tells him if your father could see you now, he would be proud. But I think they needed a scene with Hakoda to show that. Now, maybe they're waiting until season 2 to do that, but I just find it to be so weird where there are so many moments where they brought up stuff from like season 2 and season 3, as we'll talk about, but like we're potentially having to wait to get this Hakoda resolution. I think they just sort of balanced this out a little bit by having maybe Sokka remember the moment Hakoda gave him the responsibility to protect the tribe. Have the reverse of this scene of like, I expected more from him, but then as Hakoda leaves for war, here is his like true confidence in Sokka as like the reversal of that. I think you just needed a little bit of balance. The Katara one is interesting because they just gave us the entire Southern Raiders backstory, but without the Southern Raiders vengeance plot. Now, obviously, from a season 3 perspective, I worry, have you taken away too much from what that episode could be? You can still do it, but we already know the flashback, but I think the episode super works because of how the flashback is told, but we'll see how they maybe attempt to do that. I think the only thing here is just kind of sense of just contain yourself. Like, let certain scenes exist where they exist, and only bring something from future seasons if you absolutely have to. And that's the one thing with Katara here, is just like, I wonder, like, was this absolutely required to do this here? And could you not come up with anything else, or a slight other way, a different way to do this than just this? I understand that they really wanted to emphasize this over the course of the season, because it gets brought up with multiple characters, but especially with the timing of, like, she already had this thing with Jet, I'm not sure if this was correctly placed here, is probably my thoughts on it overall. But I can see their vision, like with kind of the Omashu arc. I can see what they were trying to do here in terms of setting this up as a 2-parter, and then, and you have to go over here and then come back here to resolve it, because ultimately Ko is the spirit that you have to deal with, and this is a much trickier prospect than Heibai, basically. So, that brings us into then my top 3. So, my number 3 on my list is going to be N102 Warriors, so the second episode. And I think this is just one of those examples early on in the season, like, they gave this episode the time it needed, where it basically is just a little bit of 103, but it's mostly 104, just fleshed out with extra Kyoshi stuff, extra focus on Suki, because we know she's going to become important down the line, and it worked really well for them. They were still, for the most part, able to get across the Suki-Sokka dynamic that they needed to, even despite some slight awkwardness, because they had to take away, for whatever reason, the kind of sexism kind of aspect of this. It did create, I think, some awkward initial things before you kind of get into the core of the dynamic, whereas it's much clearer and cleaner, I think, in the original. But the chemistry between the actors and the characters, I think, comes across very well here, so definitely a success on the Sokka-Suki front overall. And I think Yukari being here instead of Oyaji was a nice one as well, because that also gave someone else for Suki to interact with, who wasn't one of the new characters that she was meeting. So that worked well. Even Zhao being brought into this episode, while you can maybe say to a certain degree that this kind of almost takes the place of like the Agni Kai scene, which obviously affects Zhao, he didn't feel out of place being here instead of just Zuko's crew, and him being the one to suffer the wrath of Kyoshi at the end. I thought actually worked pretty well overall. Maybe some slight little, issues I might have when it comes to just the Kyoshi stuff itself. Just in terms of, did they lean a little bit too hard into merciless warrior Kyoshi? Just her being a little bit too strict and harsh on Aang, given that Aang didn't actually run away in this version of the story. And that's just maybe their approach with the past avatars in general, of just a tad bit too, the ultimate takeaway for Aang is a little bit negative when he meets them, apart from, of course, Kyoshi actually helps him out with the avatar state, of course. But overall, it was good. They referenced bits of the Kyoshi novels pretty well, and it was a benefit, I think, being actually able to talk about who Kyoshi is early on and not having to wait another season to get there. This is a good pull forward, unlike maybe some of the other ones. So I think it definitely works what they did here. So moving into my number 2 on my list, this is going to be N106 Masks. This, I think a lot of people really love this episode. It's the Zuko backstory episode, but there's actually quite a lot of plot stuff that happens in that, like, the second half of this episode is like the Blue Spirit, but we get like 108 added in here beforehand for Aang. So we do get like our Roku scene, which I suppose, jumping into that straight away, Roku I thought was a nice contrast to Kyoshi, because Kyoshi was so kind of strict in how she portrayed herself. I liked that Roku started off with some jokes to highlight that, like, yeah, I had to deal with that all the time when I was the avatar. Like, she was my first past avatar type thing. So I like that kind of aspect of it, of, the slight switch up. Otherwise, like, Roku's pretty decent. They have to, of course, change some stuff here, because it makes sense. Kyoshi needs to give Aang certain information about the Avatar here, just because they're leaning really heavily into the idea of Aang is particularly worried about his powers, especially the Avatar state after, what happened at the Southern Air Temple. You needed to bring that up, I guess, for this version of the show. And so Roku instead gets to have this Ko interaction where he got the best of Ko by taking an object from him, and it's related to the Mother of Faces, which is a very cool comic reference. It's cool to add to the legend of Ko that, like, oh, he has a mother, and this partly explains, why he acts out in the way he does. He steals faces, whereas his mother creates faces, and there's that whole idea. So overall, like, reasonably nice, but definitely you would say Kyoshi got maybe a little bit too much shine when some of that should have been on Roku, because Roku is the avatar before Aang, not Kyoshi. Kyoshi is a more popular character because we know more about her now, and we're just waiting for the Roku novel to come out in a couple of months, of course, to hopefully get him up to a level where I think people will see more in the character. But I kind of don't like that they maybe did a little bit too much of a popularity kind of contest thing right here in terms of deciding which avatars got the focus and which ones didn't. But yes, the strength here is certainly the backstory stuff. Some slight quibbles over, did they need to have Zuko fight back in the fight? I don't really think they did. While I appreciate they did the cool moment of, like, Ozai nearly got a blast in on Ozai, and that being what Ozai really latches onto, of, like, you had too much compassion. You chose not to actually deliver the blow because I'm your father, and you think that's a good thing, but it was a bad thing. The problem with the scene, though, is that I don't think Zuko should have been powerful enough to get even close to landing a blow on Ozai. That was the point of this fight, in a way, that, like, Zuko's not meant to stand a chance. And that's partly why he doesn't even attempt to fight back, and why it makes Ozai all the more brutal, is that because he scars him. Versus, this one, I get it. You wanted Daniel Day-Kim to have a fight scene. You wanted, because you had such a notable actor for Ozai, you wanted more scenes for Ozai. But the scene worked perfectly fine as it did in the original. You didn't need to make this change, is my ultimate take on it. But a change that was really good from this episode was the 41st Division and making them the group, of course, that Zuko saves from being just slaughtered on the front lines to, they're the division that he's given as his crew. That worked super well to the point where I'd love them to tie that into the original in some way, if possible. That maybe like G is not from the 41st Division, but maybe the rest of the crew is made up of people from the 41st Division or something like that would be something reasonable that they might be able to do. But otherwise, like the Blue Spirit itself, I thought was pretty nicely adapted. It was in a way so one for one. It was almost maybe a little bit like dull that it's so exactly the same, but it's still a really high energy action scene and it works certainly. Afterwards, there's maybe a little bit of discussion to be had about, did they need to have like a 5-minute conversation about like calligraphy and really bonding in that way before wrapping it up with effectively the same scene that's there in the original, which accomplishes effectively the same and more than just this giant conversation they had beforehand. I get why maybe they felt they needed to have more of a dynamic between the two, but I've always liked the subtlety and nuance of they just need to have this minor conversation. Do you think, if we knew each other back then, we could have been friends? And it's just left out there as they've had this reasonable interaction. Zuko saves him. Aang returns the favor. Aang is trying to be nice to Zuko and just leaves him on the note of, what if we were friends? And it's just left there for a long time, rather than they actually crack a few jokes together and then this line happens. It's like, control yourself a little bit, hold back in some moments. It just kind of the way it feels overall. Which brings us into my number one pick, and that of course leaves us only one episode, and that is N101 Aang. Maybe a little bit boring, but I do honestly feel, reflecting back on it, the first episode is probably the best overall one in terms of a package put together, because you've got some of the biggest changes here with showing the full 20-minute like Sozin's Comet flashback scene, and for the most part it's one of the more accurate ones, while there's still changes of course along the way. The only I'd say major criticism I have of the opening episode is just that decision that Aang just flies on Appa, goes up high to clear his head. It is not in any way framed as I'm running away from this. It's just I'm basically going to have fun in the place that like I go to every so often, and then what a coincidence, this is when it all happens. Given how strongly the arc is hit of Aang accepting responsibility, Sokka lays into him over it. Kyoshi does. Bumi does. It might even come up a couple of other times. It's weird that they make this decision in the opening episodes that Aang didn't actually run away, and that it was this accident of circumstances rather than I actually did run away completely from my responsibilities. Just this weirdness of like they want to berate the character for it, but not actually have him be responsible. It's weird, very weird, and it's a major change that they did that I don't like. But I feel it's one of the only major ones in the opening episodes. Everything else I think is smaller scale with this, because I thought it was a great introduction to a lot of the characters and just hitting the points that you needed to, and just like, yeah, I think they introduced the core ideas of what everyone is about here pretty well. Do they give enough time for 103 at the end? Not quite, but at least they cover some more of that in the following episodes, with, really the Agni Kai being the only thing that kind of gets left out. But that's not really this episode. That is more on maybe Warriors not doing that rather than this episode. Speaking just, I suppose, a little bit more about the Sozin's Comet backstory, I don't think that it maybe needed to be as long as it was. Considering how much information was gotten across, I think you maybe could have shortened this down to be a little kind of tighter and still hit the same main beats. But overall, I do like it, because this is a big event in the Avatar universe that has always been kept rather mysterious. And I get it in the main show that they really would be cautious about showing you a full-on genocide happening. But in other material, I've always wanted to just know some more details about how did this happen, almost from like a logistics point of view. So I did appreciate that they covered some of that in their own way, with the Comet Festival, grouping up all the airbenders, the distraction covered with the Earthbender spy scene at the start, and it just, I think, got across a pretty nice thing. And I think for this version of the show, it works quite well that they bookmark the show effectively with the comet. We open up with the devastation the comet can cause, and we end with the comet is about to return. We don't know exactly when, but it's coming. And I think that does work quite well, because you know how big of a threat the comet really, really is. So they're my kind of general broad thoughts here. I wish I could have maybe spent 10-20 minutes talking about every single one of these episodes, but I didn't want this video to be crazy long. I think you've seen more of my in-depth thoughts in my initial impressions videos, and there will be more to come. And I will definitely say, my view on these will probably change. I'm already kind of thinking at the moment, was I too harsh on certain episodes? Was I not as harsh on others? Like, might Masks actually be my favorite episode? I'm not sure. Might I actually want to lower Spirited Away a little bit down, bring up one of the other ones? I'm a bit confused in some ways, but I think the broad strokes of, I think, my list, I think, are where I want them to be. But of course, in the comments, definitely let me know, what is your order of episodes? Do you agree with what I have here? Disagree? Where do you place things? I'm very interested to see where people land on this in terms of what are the kind of universally liked and universally maybe more disliked episodes, but let me know below. But yes, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.